So, this panel is about media, and it's very broad. I mean, we only have the word media, which covers just about everything. But we are definitely going to be talking about how the U.S. media covers and handles this conflict. So we have great colleagues. I'm really honored to be with you. I've been with them before, and we are likely to be on together again. We're going to start with, I'm going to do all the introductions all at once. Okay, so bear with me. I could barely see this writing, so I'm going to try to do it. So we'll begin with Katie. Katie Halper is a journalist, filmmaker, and a podcast host. I've been on her podcast. She hosts the podcast YouTube show and radio show, the Katie Halper Show, and co-hosts the podcast. Sorry, I can and YouTube. Okay, thank you. This now we can see. All right, okay. Uh, okay, where we are, Katie was. But the one point that you should take a note of. Katie was fired from the Hills Rising, the newspaper, right?
The show,
The show, where she had been a weekly guest and occasional host for over 2 years after writing a monologue arguing that Israel is an apartheid state. So that's how the media deals with our issues. She's working on a documentary about Jewish Holocaust survivors speaking out against the genocide in Gaza. Then we have Ryan Grimm, a colleague of mine. We often together in the briefing room. Ryan Grimm is a longtime DC reporter, breaking news from the hallways of Congress and leading the Washington bureaus for the Intercept, the HuffPost. At HuffPost, he led a team that was twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Not surprised. And won once. Grimm has spent years chronicling the rise of progressives in Congress, and his most recent book is The Squad, OAC and the Hope of the Political Revolution, which followed his best-selling We Have Got People. He is also the author of the 2009 book, This Is Your Country on Drugs. And then finally, and last but not least, of course, is Laila Al-Arian, a true champion of the Palestinian cause. Laila is a Washington, D.C. based journalist and the executive producer of Fault Lines. Okay. An award-winning current affairs program on Al Jazeera English. She began her time on the program as a producer, making documentaries and on subjects ranging from the Trump administration's Muslim ban to the impact of the heroin epidemic on children, and an investigation into factory conditions producing garments for Walmart and Gap in Bangladesh. Wow, the sweatshops, huh? Most recently, she was the executive producer and co-writer of The Night Won't End, which everybody should see. The Night Won't End, Biden's War on Gaza. You all must see it. If you have not seen it, go ahead and get it. You should. A feature-lengthy documentary produced by Al Jazeera English for her work. She has been honored with 2 news and documentary Emmys, a Peabody, a George Polk, a Robert E. F. Kennedy Award in journalism, and Overseas Press Club Award. She has been nominated for 21 news and documentary Emmys. So without further ado, we're going to start. Thank you all for agreeing to be on this panel. And we're going to start with Katie. She is going to show us the bias that is really inherent in U.S. media and the way U.S. media covers the Palestinian issue. So
Great.
go
Thank
ahead.
you so much. And thank you everyone for coming, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm not going to be reading notes for most of this, but there are certain things that I just wanted to read before we jump into this video, which is not on yet. Okay, great. And also, I'm very honored that all of the people on this panel have come on my show. So thank you so much. You guys have graced my show with your presences. So I think that most people in the room know that there's a major bias in Western corporate media, pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian bias, but it's not just that. You could argue that the Western media has been complicit in genocide, and someone much more qualified than me has said that. Craig McIver, a longtime human rights lawyer and former director of the New York office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, made that very argument. He said, quote, Western media companies, he wrote at Mondo Weiss in August, have made themselves a part of the mechanism of genocide in Palestine, and there are historical precedents for holding them accountable. So I do hope that they will be held accountable. People know about this bias, but it's also worth looking at it from a quantitative lens. And actually the Intercept, where you were politics editor, did a really important study. So they looked at coverage of the first 6 weeks following October 7th by the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times. And according to the Intercept, they showed a, quote, consistent bias against Palestinians, disproportionately emphasized Israeli deaths in the conflict, and used emotive language to describe the killing of Israelis, but not Palestinians, end quote. And for example, the term slaughter was used to describe the killing of Israelis versus Palestinians 60-1. Massacre was used to describe the killing of Israelis versus Palestinians 125-2. And horrific was used to describe the killing of Israelis versus Palestinians 36-4. What we see a lot is Israel, is the Western media acting as a kind of arm of Israeli Hasbara. And we also see this very dangerous feedback loop where Western media repeats the claims of the Israeli government, and then the Israeli government can point to the Western media reporting on the claims, and it's a self-fulfilling, it's a dangerous feedback loop. And there's a whole media Israeli military industrial complex that we see at work. I think that one of the clearest ways that we see this bias is in the way that rape has been reported on. And as people probably noticed, people ranging from Kamala Harris to Hillary Clinton to Sheryl Sandberg pushed the claim that there was this mass rape perpetuated by Hamas on October 7th. And as we now know, that is a baseless claim, though you wouldn't know that from reading the Western media because they never really corrected it after they spread the lie. And you guys at the Intercept did some really important, and you in particular did some really important work debunking these claims. But I'm gonna compare the way the Western media talks about this non-existent mass rape campaign that didn't happen, and I'm gonna compare that to the way they talk about the documented rape that we know did happen. The difference is the victims of that were Palestinian. And I also should note that Josh Paul, thank you so much for your bravery. And you spoke out about this on Christiane Amanpour's show very early on when you relayed a story about how the State Department brought a credible case of sexual abuse. I believe it was a young man who had been raped by an Israeli interrogator. You brought it to the Israeli government, and their response was to shut down the organization which brought you that complaint. So I want to show a clip of Dana Bash because this really, I think, crystallizes the bias that we're talking about on this panel. This is her back in December.
Sexual violence.
Oh, not yet. Sorry.
Sexual violence.
1 second. Let me just set this up. So this is from December. And this was before the mass rape, mass sexual violence hoax had been debunked. And again, you wouldn't know it's been debunked. But I just want to show what Dana Bash says on CNN, how Pramila Jayapal responds, and then how Dana Bash responds to that. Okay.
I want to ask you about sexual violence. And it's kind of remarkable that this issue hasn't gotten enough attention globally. Widespread use of rape, brutal rape, sexual violence against Israeli women by Hamas. I've seen a lot of progressive women, generally speaking, they're quick to defend women's rights and speak out against using rape as a weapon of war, but downright silent on what we saw on October 7th and what might be happening inside Gaza right now to these hostages. Why is that?
I mean, I don't know that that's true. I think we always talk about the impact of war on women in particular. In fact, I remember 20 years ago, I did a petition around the war in Iraq.
You said
saying that,
talked about it since October 7th.
And I've condemned what Hamas has done. I've condemned
specifically
all of
women.
the actions. Absolutely, the rape, of course. But I think we have to remember that Israel is a democracy. That is why they are a strong ally of ours. And if they do not comply with international humanitarian law, they are bringing themselves to a place that makes it much more difficult strategically for them to be able to build the kinds of allies, to keep public opinion with them. And frankly, morally, I think we cannot say that one war crime deserves another. That is not what international humanitarian law says.
Okay, with respect, I was just asking about the women, and you turned it back to Israel. I'm asking you about Hamas. In fact,
I already answered your question, Dana. I said it's horrific, and I
Okay.
think that rape is horrific, sexual assault is horrific. I think that it happens in war situations. Terrorist organizations like Hamas obviously are using these as tools.
Mhm.
However, I think we have to be balanced about bringing in the outrages against Palestinians.
Yeah.
15,000 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli airstrikes, 3/4 of whom
and it's
are women and children.
and it's horrible, but you don't see Israeli soldiers raping.
Well, Dana, I
Palestinian
think
women.
we're not.
Okay, so that is a pretty disgusting example of what I think this panel is dedicated to exploring and exposing. And what's so useful about this exact clip is that you don't only see Dana Bash furthering this lie, but you see how atrocity propaganda functions, right? So what does she do? Pramila Jayapal dares to bring up the death, suffering of Palestinians. And Dana Bash's response is basically to shut her up, but also minimize that by pointing to a non-existent mass rape campaign. And that, of course, is done because, and I heard this after October 7th, I heard people say stuff like, well, there's violence, and there's what they're doing. Like what the Israeli army was doing was okay because it was kind of like high tech and technical. But the rape is different. Rape is different. And it's because they want to dehumanize the Palestinians. And this is a trope we've seen used in the United States with Black men. Often the justification given for lynching of Black men was that they had raped white women. And so we see this is a similar thing with the Arab brown savage who is raping defenseless women. But what's so fascinating is that Dana Bash never brought up the rape that was documented of Palestinians perpetuated by the Israelis. And here's how you know this isn't a conspiracy theory, because often when you bring these things up to people, they really do look at you like you're crazy. But luckily, the Israeli media is a lot more honest than the Western media. And they themselves reported on this story, this incredibly disturbing story that I'm sure you here know about, but the rest of the country doesn't, where this is just one example. A Palestinian detainee was grabbed. He was by multiple soldiers, and there's really no other word to describe this, and I'm sorry, but he was gang raped on video. Now, you didn't see the actual gang rape. You saw him brought behind something, but it was obvious enough that the Israeli media reported on it as gang rape. He was also then hospitalized and couldn't walk and had internal injuries. What happened next is that you had the Israeli police, shockingly, actually attempt to detain some of these rapist soldiers. And then what happens? Israeli society, including politicians, have protests, not protests against rape, but protests against daring to punish the rapists. And these were dubbed the right to rape protests. Then what do you have? Then you have a member of the Knesset who says in public, this is not a hot mic moment, this wasn't off the record, he says in public during a Knesset session that when he's asked rhetorically by someone, is it legitimate to insert sticks into people's rectums? And he says, yes, it is legitimate. So you have a member of the Knesset sanctioning this behavior. And then you have an Israeli rabbi blessing one of the rapists. And you also have various rapists making appearances on Israeli television shows. Now, the Western media, the Times did report on this in one story, but the actual rape and what happened to the man with the sticks was like paragraphs down. I mean, it wasn't in the headline. Now, can you just imagine for a second if you had documented rape committed by members of Hamas, you had then a member of Hamas saying it was legitimate, and then you had an imam sanctioning this behavior. Can you imagine the headlines, the nonstop ad nauseum coverage that this would receive? But we barely see it covered at all. And I know this because when I bring it up to people who don't follow this, they look at me like I'm an insane person. So again, you have not a non-existent mass rape covered ad nauseum. You had Kamala Harris saying during the DNC that people were horribly raped on October 7th. Also, I don't know why she said horribly raped, as if that requires a qualifier. But also she sounded like Trumpian, horribly raped. You could just hear him say that. And then when there's actual documented rape, the same people who push that story are mum. You don't hear Dana Bash, who talked about the rape, talk about it. You don't hear Jake Tapper talk about it. So that's just one example that I wanted to bring up.
Thank you, Katie. I mean, I think the operative word is really dehumanizing the Palestinians. You know, there's this whole thing, what we have seen since the very beginning, always, as a matter of fact, it's not, but we're highlighted since October 7, 2023, is the dehumanization of the Palestinians all along. I mean, we all know, and I think Ryan will probably speak on this issue. We all know how the New York Times, you know, the illustrious New York Times, how they were actually instructed their reporters and their writers and so on not to use the word occupation, not to use the word genocide, you know, for all these things, and many others. You know, what we have seen in this since October 7 is basically not to dehumanize, but actually to make them expendable, to make Palestinians expendable. And that's exactly what we see. We have a colleague on Twitter, and I don't know her personally, but you know, Asad, and she does a masterful job. What she does, she brings in the headline and actually changes the words, you know, replaces them, and it shows how they ought to read, which they never do. So that takes me to you, Ryan, to speak about this point. I mean, how the U.S. media basically, you know, uses this tactic to continue to give cover for the Israeli aggression and Israeli crimes, and to dehumanize the Palestinians.
Yeah, and these are excerpts up here behind me from the New York Times today, in their article about the football fight in Amsterdam. And I want to talk about this in a moment. But on your point there, each of these moments over the last year, and you could chart them, and this might be something interesting for Al Jazeera's like investigative unit that has time to do it. Like you can chart, okay, so it was December 4th. So this interview was on December 5th. And December 4th, there was an event at the United Nations with the Israeli ambassador, Sheryl Sandberg, attacking women's groups for not having spoken up the last 2 months to condemn rape. And you're like, and it's such an absurd charge that it sets you on your back foot, because you're shocked. Like, what? Wait, women's groups are okay with rape? How on earth did this happen? And then you step back and you're like, oh, they're not presenting evidence of a systemic rape campaign because they don't have any of that evidence. They're skipping right over that step and saying that these women's groups have not condemned this thing that nobody at that point had even really ever alleged. And so it was true that there were not statements from NOW or other women's groups in America condemning a thing that nobody had actually alleged yet. So then the other point, which was probably obvious to people here, especially in hindsight as we're watching this, Pramila, kind of also taken aback by the question, she concedes all the points. And she says, of course I condemn this, because of course, who doesn't? Everybody condemns that. But Dana Bash had never actually presented any evidence that any of it had actually happened. But you're a member of Congress, somebody's talking about rape, I condemn rape. The follow-up to this is that she spent days in the media barrel, had to put out statements, had her members of her own party attacking her for the answer that she gave here, saying that it is a tragedy that we need to remember that 15,000 innocent people have been killed. For that statement that you just saw, she spent a week or so getting ruthlessly attacked by her own party. And so the point I was making on the timeline, I don't remember exactly what had happened because the IDF had committed so many atrocities over the course of the last year. There had been something in the week prior that had really set back the Israelis in terms of international opinion. And every time that would happen, soon after that, this is where the media comes in, there would be a new distraction. And this was the one that went through December and then culminated at the end of December with this kind of fantastical New York Times story that they then submitted for awards and which has been, dissected so thoroughly. And the executive editor did an interview with his own kind of Times reporters recently about that article, and he said, was it 100% accurate? Nothing's 100% accurate. He said, but it was fundamentally true. Like the essence of it was true. Like, okay, yes, like we had to walk back like major pieces of it and the rest of it's contradictory. And
This is true.
but the assumption on which it rests that these people are rapists, he's like, that's true. So you don't really need our article to prove it, even though their article was presented at the time as the kind of definitive proof that actually this thing, and notice how backwards this goes. This is December 4th and 5th that they're complaining that nobody has condemned this thing. It was December 28th when the New York Times finally comes out and says, oh, this thing that we were complaining you had not condemned, we have now proven that it actually happened. And then within days, the story had completely fallen apart.
Including it was also rejected, just want to insert, by the alleged victims' family members who pushed back against the claim and said that the journalist misrepresented himself and the story.
Yeah, all over the place. And the last point on what Katie was saying, that debate in the Knesset, nobody inside that debate actually was disagreeing that the soldiers were okay doing what they were doing. The ones who were supportive of criminal prosecution of the rapists said that the only reason that they were for that is that it is a necessity to avoid international war crimes. Because the way that international humanitarian law, international war crimes law works, as I'm sure everybody here knows, that the international court only has jurisdiction within a country if that country is derelict in prosecuting its own war criminals. But if they can show that they are charging some people with some crimes, then they can continuously push back against the ICC and say, you don't have jurisdiction here because we're a democracy and we follow the rule of law. And so what the one camp, I guess the left camp, I guess you would call it, was saying, we have to prosecute a few of these people, or else we're all going to get prosecuted. Like that's their argument. And then the counter argument is screw them all. Like, well, they have no jurisdiction, period. So on the question of dehumanization, this article, if people haven't read the full article in today's New York Times, I highly recommend it. The entire thing is just absolutely incredible. I just want to read a couple of the pieces here. So the way that violence is described on one side versus the other. So the one they say videos circulating on social media and a video distributed by the AP provide a glimpse of the tensions in the hours leading up to the violence. So tensions are just kind of presented as having manifested themselves through no agency or actions of any people. Eventually, way down in the article, they get to a part where they talk about how it actually started because there was a mob of fans who support the Israeli team who were kind of rampaging through neighborhoods, ripping down Palestinian flags, chanting anti-Arab slogans, beat up a cab driver, just raising mayhem. So that gets a passive line or two in the article, and right after that, they say this. This is right after they do acknowledge the anti-Arab action. It's the one that starts while the exact sequence of events remained unclear, The violence appeared to be the product of two combustible forces in Europe: the unrest that often accompanies gatherings of hardcore soccer fans and tensions over the year-long Israeli military offensive in Gaza. So the sentence prior to that one, they had just mentioned the anti-Arab bigotry. In the next sentence, they forgot about that. You could say that there are three. If you like a normal, a normal reporter who's just observing the thing, there's three things going on here. These are all hooligans, and so there's going to be violence. People are angry about the war in Gaza, genocide in Gaza, however they want to phrase it in the New York Times, and also the Islamophobia in Europe, which is a well-documented phenomenon. But it just completely vanishes from the article because of the inability to see one half of these combatants as humans. And so, and I think the reporter, it was the Korea desk, you can tell from the byline that like wrote, because it's happening overnight, the Korea desk is covering this. And if you are watching videos of two people fighting, and on the one side you see Arabs, they're actually Moroccans, but whatever. And on the other side, you see Israelis.
Brown people.
Yeah, brown people. And you have a fundamental dehumanization of the one side, then you don't ask yourself what happened before this, because it doesn't matter, because that it's a beast. That's not a human. That's a person who's just motivated by hatred and anti-Semitism and is beating up this person because they're Jewish. And there's no reason to ask what happened before that. And in the office, it might even be offensive to even ask, like, what happened? Like, where did this fight come from? Even though when it's a fight between football fans, like, you usually want to find out what happened first. Like, there's usually something going on here.
Right. We're going to go to Laila, but please, feel free to chime in, to question each other on whatever topic that the speaker is raising.
Who won the game? Just kidding.
Okay.
Oh, and there's also footage that didn't make it into this article. If people haven't seen it, there was a minute of silence for the
Yeah,
victims of the
yeah.
Valencia flood, and the fans of the Israeli team are just screaming like anti-Arab stuff like through the entire minute of silence,
Right.
which I don't think anybody should be beaten up for that. You do that at a football match, you're probably gonna get beaten up. Like that's what football matches are in Europe.
They were also mad at Spain because Spain's position on Palestine, so they didn't want to.
Right. So
sit
no
without
moment of silence for you.
victims of
Right.
Valencia floods. Yeah.
Laila, I want to ask you to give everybody here an idea on your film, The Night Won't End, Biden's War on Gaza, which is really a riveting and a very profound and compelling presentation. And I know we have a colleague, Brent Thacker, who keeps talking about this in the briefing room. I think he makes the point every time that 300 days have passed and so on, and he's been asking about this issue and never a response. So please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. It's an honor to share this panel with you three people I admire so much for your work. So I don't want to say too much about the film, because if you haven't seen it, I want you all to go home and watch it. It's on YouTube. It's YouTube doesn't make it that easy to watch because it's considered too graphic. So you actually have to type in "The Night Won't End Al Jazeera," and that's how you'll find it. It's not like very easily searchable, but the reason we wanted to make the film is because for 14 months now, but when we decided to make it, it was a few months in, we've been told that we can't believe our eyes. We can't actually believe what we see. The videos that we're seeing from Gaza, from the journalists, from the people who are live streaming their own genocide, the killing and maiming of their family members, none of that is true. And we've talked a little bit about some of the problems with the Western or legacy or corporate media coverage that tells us we can't believe our eyes, or we can't believe Palestinians as reliable narrators of their own killing, their own genocide. So what we did was we worked with journalists on the ground in Gaza, And I should mention that more than 180 journalists have been killed in the last 14 months. It's broken by far any record of the number of journalists killed anywhere since the Committee to Protect Journalists has started keeping records in 1992. And yet it has, for the most part, been met with a resounding silence from my industry, from the media industry, because of the dehumanization of Palestinians that we talked about earlier, and also because of something that the American politician or diplomat Aaron David Miller said to the New Yorker a few months ago when he was asked about whether President Biden feels the same for Palestinians as he does for Israeli life. And he said, no, I don't think he has the same depth of feeling for Palestinians as he does for Israelis. And I really appreciated that honesty, because I think, unfortunately, the same could apply for many of the people who run newsrooms in the West and who also report on Palestinians and what's happening. I don't want to paint the entire media with a broad brush, because obviously there's people who see the humanity of Palestinians, who are committed to covering what's happening. But for the most part, those who set the agenda, the tone of the coverage, and who run the newsrooms, I think, have a lack of depth of feeling for Palestinians, and also see themselves in Israel and see Israel in the West. And there's this kind of recognition, this sympathy extends to and really influences the coverage. So our film looks at war crimes committed by the Israeli military within a certain period of time. And we're very honored that Josh Paul, who spoke to you all today, I don't know if he's still here, but he's part of the film. He gives his analysis for why his reasons for why he resigned, as well as kind of some of the bigger structural issues, because in addition to working with journalists in Gaza to cover the genocide, to cover specific war crimes, we also look at the Biden administration's ongoing, unwavering, and critical support for Israel and its genocide. And the three families we look at is the Salem family, who lost 100 members of their extended family in an airstrike in December, and then 1 week later had Israeli soldiers come to their doors and commit a massacre, where after beating and terrorizing essentially the women, children, and men, they separated the women and children from the men, but had them watch as they carried out point-blank executions of the men. We also looked at the case of Hind Rajab. Said mentioned that Prem Thacker, formerly of the Intercept, now of Zeteo News, has been really staying after the State Department on what they're doing about pursuing some kind of justice or some kind of accountability for Hind Rajab's killing. Of course, they keep deferring to Israeli investigations, despite a very long record of Israel basically either not investigating or not holding anyone accountable in these killings. But we did really a forensic reconstruction of what happened to Hind, as well as the rescue workers who went to get her. And then finally, we looked at the case of Abdullah Al-Ghaf and his family, who, and the idea behind that was to look into whether safe zones truly exist in Gaza. Of course, this is something that we hear John Kirby and others in the Biden administration say, well, there's safe zones, just follow the Israeli military's orders and you'll be fine. And of course, this family fled the north of Gaza, went south, went to Khan Yunis because they were told to. And then before they knew it, there was an airstrike on the family home, and Abdullah lost his wife and 2 of his sons. And the reason we knew about the case is there was a video that went viral of Abdullah kissing his son's feet and saying, I went to the store to get you biscuits, and putting biscuits in his son's shroud. So, the idea was also to kind of pay tribute to these families by showing them in the detail and density, as Edward Said put it, the detail and density of their lives that is so lacking in the mainstream media. So when Israelis are covered, you know everything about them, their favorite color, what they used to like to eat, the love they have for each other. It's even with this debunked New York Times piece that Ryan mentioned, just the way that it's packaged, front page, photographs, narrative style of writing that really brings you in. When Palestinian suffering is covered, if it's even covered at all, including the piece that Katie mentioned, where the torture, the sexual torture and rape of Palestinians is mentioned all the way at the end, it's very detached, clinical, like who, what, when, where, why, how, that's it. And it's buried, and they bury the lead. It's detached, it's clinical, it's I think oftentimes very much influenced by what the Israeli military or Israeli propaganda is telling them. In that specific article Katie mentioned about the rape, there were some of the most bizarre lines I've ever read in any piece of journalism. So the writer, Patrick Kingsley, who's been a really loyal stenographer of the Israeli military throughout the past 14 months of genocide, his way of kind of saying, like, we don't really have evidence that torture is happening here, was he would say, well, I didn't see anyone be tortured, as he was touring the torture center. Or he would say, a Palestinian detainee peeked out from under his blindfold, but they didn't do anything to him. So he would just insert these very strange lines, kind of attempting to sort of excuse whatever horrific testimony was coming out. So yeah, I mean, I think our film, which is feature-length film, but it's online, it's available, it's been screened all over. It's really just one effort to forensically investigate these atrocities. Again, I can use the word atrocity, but in the mainstream media, you're not allowed to use that when it comes to Palestinians, that have happened in the last 14 months. But what breaks my heart is it barely skims the surface, because the Palestinian journalists and the Palestinian people themselves are telling us what's happening, but they can't do it all. And what troubles me is I know there's crimes happening every single day that we don't even know about.
And one point on that real quickly, this Patrick Kingsley story that she describes is also so fascinating, because it shows how defined the pattern is. That, like, I'm sure this is the case for Laila and Katie, but as soon as I saw that story, I thought, oh wow, there is something huge coming out, because Patrick Kingsley, and I think maybe Ronan was a co-author on that, are known as, they're very close sources in the IDF and Israeli government, and they're not known as investigative reporters. So for them to have uncovered, and I think it was about a 3,000-word article, and the very last few paragraphs, they mention the rape. Like, they mentioned that somebody was raped. And you're like, wait, how did they uncover this? Like, they're not investigative reporters. So now we know that they buried it all the way at the bottom, yet it's still in the paper. So why? Oh, clearly the Israeli sources told them about this. And so clearly they're getting in front of something. And sure enough, a week or two later, that's when the debates start to happen, because what we learned is that there was video of it. And because there was video of it, there were going to be international criminal charges brought, unless there was some way of getting in front of it. To have an entire year-long debate at the New York Times about their article that never managed to find any evidence for rape, let alone systemic rape, to have that followed up by actual evidence of it by IDF prison guards landing in their lap, and to have it buried all the way at the bottom and then obfuscated with all of these weird descriptions of Laila said it well. These weird moments were like, well, okay, so yes, there were some people that didn't get tortured at some times. Just really does show the depth of it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most compelling things that I have seen in a statement over the past few months, I think it was Laila Al-Arian that coined it, and she said that every accusation the Israelis make against the Palestinians is basically a confession of what they do to Palestinians. And it's very true. I mean, there's so much evidence of all these crimes that Israeli soldiers commit. I mean, what we saw when Raz this morning showed the two soldiers saying Nakba, again, and so on. So they say it, but nonetheless, it is always overlooked. I mean, I know we engage in discussions, and really long discussions in the briefing room. I mean, Gaza takes a great deal of the discussion every single day, but they always, And there are some good questions, and I'm talking about corporate media. I mean, they ask good questions. Our colleagues from CBS, our colleagues from ABC, they always, but it never makes its way to the newscast. It never makes it. Why is that? Why do you think that is?
It's a fascinating question because if you only lived in the State Department press briefing room, you would think we had an adversarial press that was holding the U.S. government to account. And then you look at the actual coverage that has to then filter through the editorial processes at these news outlets, and you see essentially none of it, rising to actual publication, which speaks to everything we're talking about here, but it also speaks to the power of social media to bypass all of that. And I think that, and particularly, Said, after you became kind of this celebrity for going after Matt Miller, making him look so silly, and those clips became part of people's daily diets, and it was at least satisfying to see somebody pressing them on it. I think you tell me if you detected a change, but I think reporters in the room saw, and I think rightly were frustrated at their inability to get their good questions and turn them into actual journalistic product in their news organizations. And I think it sharpened their confrontational questions because they realized, okay, maybe this won't get into my broadcast or into my paper, but it turns out there are tens of millions of people around the world who are going to see it anyway, and I'm going to be able to cut past my editors. Do you think that dynamic unfolded a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. I think that what we have seen over the past 13 months is that, because it used to be I would go to the briefing room. I always asked about Palestine. I mean, that was my job all along. And there would be maybe a couple of others that would ask questions, Matthew Lee being one of them, and so on, from time to time, but mainly I would. But since then, it became, you can't, it's something huge. You can't escape it. So everybody was asking, and I think despite the fact that these questions and, this trying to hold their feet to the fire, so to speak, even though they don't make it to the newscast or they don't make it to the front pages, they make it online. They make it online, and they're all over the place, and sometimes, before you finish your questions, I mean, Simon's questions is great. Simon, our colleague from Reuters, he has these wonderful questions, and it's making it, whether it's not, may not be published, in Reuters or AP or whatever, but it's there. It's there, and that it really does make a difference. I think the one thing, and I must acknowledge, I don't know about other foreign ministries and so on, but I don't think you're likely to see this kind of exchange. And I don't want to be, applauding the U.S. government, but that is a forum in many ways that is unique, and we should take advantage because we may soon be denied that. I don't know whether we're going to have the same kind of briefings and the same kind of latitude in the next administration. But it is something that we ought to take advantage of.
Can I
Please,
say
Laila.
something though? So for our film, The Night Won't End, for 4, maybe 5 months straight, we asked the State Department for an interview. And we're Al Jazeera English. Our audience is perhaps no other network's audience is more affected by the story. And also, frankly, the Arab American, Muslim American, et cetera, community, who are also a community of voters, also watch Al Jazeera English. They refuse to give us an interview. And I think that says a lot about, the hypocrisy of talking about the importance of freedom of press and being accessible and open to the media, and then refusing to sit down and actually answer questions. And that's shameful, I think.
We're going to go to Q&A a little bit, but they're not going to give you an interview. They will probably, I think they gave Al Jazeera Arabi an interview, or from time to time. But in the past 4 years, I have asked for interviews, and they did not give me any. And, Pompeo used to give me questions all the time, and in fact, the Republicans have. I mean, in the old days, I remember Colin Powell used to give us questions all the time. We would meet with him almost on daily basis, and he would give you and we would respond. But not these guys. These guys, I ran into Blinken a couple of times in the hallway, and he said, you know, how are you holding up? And I say, well, I'm all right. How are you holding up? You know, and and I would ask him. I said, yeah, sure. You know, I mean, just send me a message. You know, through this and so on. But they will never respond. They're not going to give you the interview. They feel that the traveling press is good enough, you know, and of course they will give it to CNN or say ABC or CBS and so on. So I want to ask you a question, you know, about the elephant in the room. I think Khalid named it on the upcoming administration. Do you feel that you as a journalist will have the same kind of access or the same kind of ability to pose your questions? What is your assessment? And I'll tell you about my experience with the previous.
So I think, yeah, I'm curious for your experience in the previous administration, since we've, you know, kind of have a model to go on. I would think that the Democrats are going to engage with, at least with me in particular. Well, it actually depends. There's different factions within the Trump and MAGA movement, and I'm well sourced in kind of the more isolationist faction of it, like, which is, you know, Don Jr., even JD Vance, Tucker Carlson, you know, that whole kind of weird isolationist wing. If they prevail, and we'll see, you know, Mike Pompeo is trying to get in. We wrote a story last night that his bid is on the rocks, that he has a lot of opposition from the anti-neocon faction within the Trump administration. So if that one prevails, then I'd probably have more ability to engage. But it also, some of its time, I've known these guys for a long time.
Pompeo may not be
right. I think he's not on solid ground.
He's the most loyal.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's
Right.
loyal to Trump.
He's also born again, right? He wants like people like me to go back to Israel, where, like, as Lily said, I think 400 of us get to live and everyone else burns for all eternity and converts.
But you will be given a choice.
Yeah.
You know, either you convert or, you know, you're done.
Yeah.
We're done.
Yeah.
All right.
I think
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, how often did they hold briefings back then, and what was your relationship with them?
Very interesting story, because we had you know, we had the transition, and of course, you know, Kirby, of course, ran off, you know, on I think it was January 20th at noon. They left. They had to leave and so on. But then Mark Toner took over. And Mark Toner, they asked him to stay on, and it's amazing because he had to switch. You know, like he had to reflect the new administration's priorities and lingo and all these things and positions. So it has changed. So, and that's exactly what we will see. I don't think that even Miller in the next few weeks, I don't believe he's going to, you know, stick to the same lines as before, because, you know, let's face it, politics have changed and so on. But then after that, I remember that Tillerson came to the bullpen and sat with us, and he says, well, what do you guys want? And I said, well, Mr. Secretary, we need the briefings back. And he was like, well, you know, what are the briefings? You know, that kind of a thing. And we said, it's when we gather, we ask questions to the spokesperson and so on. I said, oh, we'll see how, you know, whether this fits in the schedule or the agenda and so on. But thereafter, we had briefings twice a week, you know, first with Heather Nauert, you know, and I mean, they came in from Fox News, so they carried that, you know, Fox News kind of dynamics. And then with Ortegas, you know, Morgan Ortegas, who was probably coming back to be the spokesperson, you know, so she ran for Congress. She didn't know the district that she was running for. So, but I think she's coming back. She's a star, or she aspires to be, you know, maybe an ambassador somewhere, or Stefanik is coming to become, I think, the UN ambassador. So yeah, I mean, the things will change, but we are not going to have the same kind of regular briefings as we do now. Yeah. You want to talk about your other?
I want to hear what Katie has. Did you want to jump in about something?
Oh, I was just saying that I think one of the silver, I mean, people have different takes on the election results, but one of, I think, perhaps the silver linings is that we'll see the, MSNBC, CNN, maybe will finally be upset about what's happening in Gaza because Trump's going to be doing it as opposed to Biden, where they don't seem upset. I mean, Joy-Ann Reid, I guess, at MSNBC has done some stuff where you get the sense she sees Palestinians as human beings, which I guess makes her unique on that network. Not some, I guess Chris Hayes too, maybe. Anyway, but it's not a lot of people, obviously. So that's something that I think people maybe are looking forward to. But, I also have to say that, Jake Tapper and Dana Bash are very dangerous, and they really have their finger on the pulse of or a part of the Hezbollah that comes out of Israel. And it's really bad. I also kind of selfishly as a Jew, I don't like it because they wear their Jewish identity on their sleeves and act in a very biased way, an unethical way. And people, I think, will say okay, these are Jewish journalists. This is what they do. They're not Jewish. I mean, they are Jewish, but they're Jewish supremacists. And that's very different. And I think seeing that is, I mean, like Lily said earlier, makes all Jews unsafe. It also really I don't want to even say this, but it kind of leans into the media into the trope of Jews controlling the media. When you hear them saying these things and they're so clearly repeating and echoing what the Israeli government says, and they're so clearly biased towards them, it makes me incredibly uncomfortable. That's just on a selfish level, self-interested level. It's obviously wrong, it's unethical, it's and dehumanizing. But to see what's so hard about media bias is that unless you are really looking hard, you don't even get the bias because you can't contrast what they're saying with what the reality is. But every now and then they show their hand. And we saw this with Rashida Tlaib when she criticized the Attorney General of Michigan, Dana Nessel, for prosecuting student protesters. And the Attorney General totally made up the fact that Rashida Tlaib was singling her out because she's Jewish. I mean, Rashida Tlaib said nothing of the sort. There was literally nothing you could have read into at all. And what happens? Jake Tapper literally takes the tweet from the Attorney General where she accuses Rashida Tlaib of anti-Semitism, asks the Governor Whitmer to condemn it. She doesn't condemn it. She I don't think she even knew what had happened because this was just a random tweet that Jake Tapper chose to elevate. Then Jewish Insider writes a story about how Gretchen Whitmer refuses to condemn anti-Semitism. Then the ADL comments on it. Then Jake Tapper tweets out the ADL's tweet. Then Dana Bash does a story about it and reports on how there's a failure to call out anti-Semitism on both sides. And the example she gives is Donald Trump saying, if I lose, it'll be because Jewish voters. And Tom Cotton refused to condemn that. And then the other side was Gretchen Whitmer, Gretchen Whitmer refusing to condemn the non-existent anti-Semitism of Rashida Tlaib. But that was just an example of how you saw in real time this total coordinated smear.
There's one other layer to that. So the reason that this came up was because Rashida Tlaib had been attacked by the cartoonist in the National Review with this. It was a cartoon, and on Rashida Tlaib's desk was a pager that had exploded. And it
says, that's odd, my pager just went off.
Right. And so people are beginning to condemn this and say, we stand with Rashida Tlaib. This is deplorable. You should apologize to her. Dana Nessel then immediately takes to Twitter with this comment, and she digs up an article from 10 days earlier in which Rashida Tlaib had said it was biased of Dana Nessel to charge these campus protesters when she hadn't charged protesters for climate change, for racial justice, and so on. And she said, and I think the bias comes from pressure that she was under from President Ono and the Board of Regents. So she's She singled out why she thought there was pressure and why there was bias. So then Nessel goes back, grabs that article, and says it is wrong for Rashida Tlaib to be, attacked for her religion, just like it's wrong for her to come after me for my religion.
Like literally equating a viciously racist cartoon with a statement by Tlaib that had nothing to do with her Jewish identity.
And it's such a perfect example of what the Israeli government continuously does on a higher level, that something bad is happening for them. And the bad thing there is that Rashida Tlaib is looking sympathetic. So Dana Ness has to come in and say, well, we can't allow Rashida Tlaib to even have a moment, like even a day of people expressing empathy or sympathy to her. So we need to step in. And then the entire story becomes, why is Rashida Tlaib such an anti-Semite, and why won't Gretchen Whitmer, condemn her for anti-Semitism?
But the story, of course, was debunked.
And then the pager cartoon just vanishes.
So what happened to the whole story? Did Jake Tapper ever apologize?
Jake Tapper's,
I saw
he went on a day or two later and he said, I want to clarify something that I said. I meant to repeat what Dana Nessel had charged, but I misspoke and I asserted it as a fact. And then he and Dana Bash both said, we have reached out to Rashida Tlaib's office for clarity, and we have not gotten a response back, but we will share that if we do. They could have just gone to the original interview, in the article where she said the bias came from President Ono and the Board of Regents.
Well, and just really quickly, what's so frustrating and infuriating is that, as you just alluded to, Jake Tapper's apology was basically, sorry, I said that I thought that Rashida Tlaib was anti-Semitic. Really, it was Dana Nessel who thought she was anti-Semitic. So Dana Nessel, can you explain why you think she's anti-Semitic? And then Dana Nessel explained why she thinks she's anti-Semitic.
Right.
So he just gave more fodder to the lie, just distanced himself as one degree from it.
That's maybe typical Jake Tapper kind of attitude. Anyway, so before we go to the Q&A, you want to talk about your next
example?
Yeah, please.
I mean, just briefly, I think everyone in this room knows that there's tremendous media bias. We know that the way it manifested is that we saw straight up fabricated stories. Jake Tapper was responsible for many of them. Al-Shifa Hospital being a command and control node for Hamas, for example, which was debunked. Anora being, overtaken by members of Hamas. Of course, that's debunked, but it doesn't matter. The point is, they put out these stories, people like Jake Tapper and, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal on the front page. It has a life of its own, and then it's debunked. And of course, the debunking never makes it to the front page. But, I just wanted to highlight one example, which was a June 8th massacre of 274 Palestinians in Nusayrat during an operation to retrieve 4 captives, including and the coverage of that, the Sunday Times, for example, called it a surgical strike. Again, 274 Palestinians were killed, with no mention of Palestinians being killed. CNN's headline is that the operation took weeks of preparation. Again, not the killing of so many Palestinians. When you Google that Nusayrat massacre, Google labels it as a rescue operation. And then, of course, we hear in detail about the lives of the 4 Israeli captives, who they were, what their stories are, and we hear nothing of the 274 Palestinians, let alone even knowing their names. Telling only part of a story is just objectively bad journalism. But this is more nefarious than that. This is obfuscating a massacre and then, attempting to justify it by reframing the whole story as merely a rescue attempt. So I think, and this is just one example from months ago. What we see now is a media blackout of what's happening in northern Gaza, where the genocide has actually escalated. There's carpet bombing, there's continuing starvation throughout Gaza, but especially in the north, but really throughout. And the ongoing story of no place in the entire Gaza Strip being safe. And I just wanted to mention that Ryan's website, which he's a co-founder of Drop Site News, has been covering northern Gaza. So I urge you all, if you want to know what's happening there, check it out, because they are working with local Palestinian journalists to actually report what the media is refusing to say.
All right, well, thank you all. We're gonna turn to you now for the Q&A. Where's the mic? Where's Miriam? You have to, okay, great. Great, let's start. I think you raised, Raz, you raised your, but please make your comment. We'd love to hear it. Because while we were talking, and I wanna, hear what you're.
I just wanted to, this recent case with the soccer and it's important, I think, to say that they were chanting, very genocidal. And they were actually singing, "May your village burn down," and another new song apparently. Why are there no schools in Gaza? Because there are no children in Gaza anymore, right? So so that's one thing, right? But it ties
with police protection. So there's videos that you see of them going down the escalator and they have all of this police protection while they're chanting and singing these completely genocidal songs, which is just another metaphor for everything.
Yeah, exactly. But so I wanted to ask just to about the briefings, okay? Because one of the things that always strikes me in the briefings is that what Miller and others are doing there is they're engaged in constant denial, basically, right? What we're seeing in front of our eyes and on our screens is not true, right? It's constant denial. So and that's how it works, right? We have these people chanting like explicit genocidal, right? We have what's happening, in Gaza and in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem and in Lebanon and actually inside Israel also. We can talk about it. Someone mentioned Israeli Palestinians before, right? And then there's this kind of crude denial that happens. So my question is about this briefing. And I know that, as you said, there's like a lot of benefit to it because, people can cut through their editors, for example. But isn't this also providing, the government like an arena to reproduce this kind of crude denialism, right, constantly?
Curious for Said's take, but I mean, obviously the government does it for a reason. Like they're not doing it for the benefit of the public or the media. They're doing it because they think that it serves their agenda. And I think overwhelmingly it probably does, but at the same time, there are also moments where you can, and also the advent of these clips becoming fodder for social media criticism does change the dynamic a little bit. And because I think so many people are so clearly able to see exactly what you're seeing, that it's not as effective, that it just discredits them so thoroughly because we do have our own eyes. But I think you're right that it's complicated.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Ryan said, that definitely the government uses the briefing to once again, be Israel's lawyer and defend Israeli action, and give it sort of an official kind of envelope or frame. Yesterday, for instance, I mean, I had an exchange on what was happening in northern Gaza, and I said there's ethnic cleansing according to the general's plan, And in fact, I talked about ethnic cleansing, and he says, "Yeah, I assume that you're talking about the general's plan." And I said, "Yes, I'm talking about the general's plan." And he says, "Yeah, well, we oppose and we oppose any forced movement of residents or people that of the people in northern Gaza. But we understand that to protect them, sometimes they have to go from place to place, as if this has been happening over and over and over again. So what Israel is doing, really, it is basically by this campaign, and that's what the government refuses to acknowledge. By this campaign is basically destroy any possibility for life in northern Gaza. So what they do when they say we're going after Hamas reconstituting itself, Hamas rebuilding and so on. What they're doing really, because people go back and try to string out something, put some things that so they can cook and eat and maybe whatever. I mean, use facilities and so on, and so they strike it again, and they will continue to do this. So yes, the government uses the briefings, whether in the White House or in the State Department to of course, to propagate its story, to propagate its line, and to defend Israel. Yes.
I also
Please,
think,
go ahead.
oh.
We have that young woman there, then we have you for this. Okay. And
Thank you. Did you want to say something before I ask my question?
oh,
Katie?
just really
Yeah.
quickly, that
Go.
I think that what happens is that it serves like three purposes. These, the way that the State Department so overtly covers for Israel. So on one level, people who buy into the propaganda see it and they think that Israel's being, like Israel's being well represented to them. Then someone like people in this room, we see it, and it's a perfect example of how Israel is being covered, right? It's an example of, it's like revealing, it's almost useful. And then one of the things that like I try to do on my shows is for people who don't already know that, you can like, there's a lot of power in editing, not deceptively editing, but like if you just took, like one thing we did was we took a clip of Kirby, like crying over the victims, the Israeli victims of October 7th, crying over Ukrainian victims. And then when it came to Palestinians, he was like, that's what happens in war. War happens. So I think it does, like the effect really depends on the audience, but I think it is the job of people who are independent media makers to put these, to use this to explain to people for whom it's not obvious.
it is also, it is a forum or a podium for stark hypocrisy. I mean, they could, in the same statement, I mean, I've seen, they would be saying, justifying what Israel does, but then condemning exactly what the Russians are doing, allegedly doing in Ukraine, especially on the bombing of hospitals.
Yeah, and real quickly, and this goes to your point earlier that the US is almost unique in having these, and is also the most powerful country in the world. And in a significant way, these briefings are an expression of that power, like the ability, because they're not, these aren't really even lies, like they're beyond lies. And there's a term for it in hip hop, actually. Sorry, this is the only term. It's called fuckery, which and you look it up. The definition of it basically is a lie that's so grand and so obvious that it is reflecting and it is expressing the power of the person to tell that lie, to disorient you, to leave you on your back foot, and to say, I know that's a lie. They know it's a lie. They know I know it's a lie. Yet they said it anyway. That's how powerful they are, and that I think is a significant part of it. That that's why they don't mind being embarrassed so frequently by us, because they're like, we were embarrassed, and yet we're going to walk off this stage and still be the most powerful country in the world and come back tomorrow and still be.
But it's also why your framing is so important, because when you guys ask questions, and I'm always surprised that they still call on you and Prem Thacker and Matt Lee, but when you also do that work by saying, wait, you just said this about Russia, now you're saying this about Israel.
Yeah, I mean, we never really let them get away with it. We try not to let them get away with it, and so on. But also, I mean, they, the stark, as I said, stark hypocrisy and so on. I remember asking a question on the human shield issue. I mean, because the Israelis put some people as human shield, and I said, you always, you condemn using people as a human shield and so on. And now the Israelis have done that. Would you call the Israeli army a terrorist army? And he said, no, it's an army. Hamas is a terrorist organization. So that's, that's just the standard thing in which they respond. So the Israelis can, in effect, can do this time and time and time again. And by the way, I mean, we don't want to talk about this now, but human shield is really an invention of the Israelis. I mean, they began doing it back in, during the Intifada. They would put the kids in front of the Jeep so the other kids don't throw stones.
It's like you said, every accusation is a confession.
So we have you there right
Yes,
there.
thank you so much. My name is Irene Galani, or Arian Galani
Irene.
for Arabic speakers. So I think my question is for any or all of you. So as an Arab, I have, as many other Arabs as well, have always been able to recognize the biases in Western mainstream media reporting, especially on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, although I recognize and I acknowledge that these biases might not be visible to everyone. But anyway, so it was only about 2 to 3 months ago that I was introduced to the Global Language Dictionary project by the Israeli project that was commissioned and published in 2009. And I was introduced to this concept by Dr. Gretchen King, working at the AUB, through a webinar that I attended. It was also, by the way, organized by Al Jazeera. So anyway, my question to you is, as independent journalists and as independent workers in the media industry, how do you think we can help audiences recognize biases in Western mainstream media reporting, especially those created through selective language? And how can we actually, and for example, also stemming from, the Hasbro or stemming from the Global Language Dictionary pushed by the Israeli project, and how can we actually get them to critically evaluate and think about what they are reading, the words that they're reading when it comes to reporting on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? Thank you.
Well, this is a shameless plug, which is every Monday I do something for one of my shows, which I co-host with Aaron Mate. The show is called Useful Idiots, ironically. And we do something called Monday Morning, spelled MOURNING. And we react to the Sunday morning news shows that we watch so that you don't have to. And so we go through it. And that's at youtube.com/useful idiots. And I also try to do it on my show at youtube.com/the Katie Halper show. But I do think that unless people already know, are already aware of it, you do kind of have to break it down. I think videos can be really helpful. Like that's why people hate TikTok so much, because it actually reveals things in a very efficient way. You just do a quick mashup and it shows it.
I mean, I would say that these legacy media organizations do pay attention if audiences reach out to them. It's not that they're always going to listen, but at least they pay attention. And pro-Israel groups have very organized campaigns to kind of try to influence the coverage. So I think if you all have feedback to give newsrooms, you should do it. And I think people who maybe are critical of the coverage sometimes maybe vent their frustrations to each other or on social media, but they don't really take social media seriously. They've made that pretty clear. So I would say sharing your feedback, making it clear why, for example, if you've unsubscribed or you no longer pay for a certain publication, why you've done that. And also supporting independent journalists like Dropsite News, like the Katie Halper's work, other people who call out this hypocrisy, these problems, and just continuing to have these conversations, because young people may not be paying attention, audiences who may be new to this issue may not be paying attention. So I think continuing to talk about it is important.
Also, fairness and accuracy in reporting, fair for people who don't like social media and want to read reporting on this. They do a great job exposing the media bias.
We're gonna go right there.
Thank you.
Oh, one of my questions was just answered. Does that include Media Matters? Is that the same group?
No, they're
Okay.
different. Media Matters is good on some stuff, not as, I mean, I would say fair is very, very reliable.
I wanted to ask you about the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
Ah.
We had a major demonstration in front of the White House dinner. But then when I went back at home and looked at the videos of the dinner, no one said anything about Palestine or Gaza. Am I right? Or maybe I missed something. So does that say something about the strength of, what some people call the Israel lobby, that you don't say anything? Then I wanted to ask you about how the press responded to Kazi Coates. It was very interesting to me to see like what he had to say. They never heard that before. Why did they not hear that before? So anyway, why did they not want to hear that before? So I'll leave that alone. Oh, and lastly, the State Department, I mean, the Pentagon has interviews like you. There's one person there, I don't know who, but they asked some similar questions that you all asked.
Wait, remind me, there was
White House
code. White House, oh, yeah.
How the press act, what happened with the private.
Right. So I mean, I have a response, but if you guys want to jump in, because
Well, just, I guess quickly on Ta-Nehisi, he is an absolute hero for liberals in the United States. And so he had an enormous amount of capital. If he writes a book, they're going to bring him on the morning shows, the nightly shows, the evening show, any show he wants. He can show up that day and they're going to put him on that show. That's might be even practically unique to him because of the role that he played from 2015 on with his writing in the Atlantic. And so they had to hear it from him and they had no choice. And it was very, as you saw, it was very clear they didn't want to hear it and tried every different angle they could to discredit him. They even went after his father for his father's independent book company publishing a book that had some like anti-Semitic conspiracies in it. They tried to tie that to him, and like they threw everything and the kitchen sink at him.
Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was interviewed on Good Morning America by,
Yeah, and his new book is called The Message,
and the guy who
which has
interviewed,
like 50 pages in the whole book about the West Bank.
and the
And
guy
it
who,
caused them to have a complete meltdown.
the guy who interviewed him, Tony DeCouple, has his ex-wife is Israeli, and he has 2 kids who live in Israel. But the way he tried to go after him was like actually so infantilizing and offensive that even people who probably didn't want to come out and defend Ta-Nehisi Coates because they don't want to defend people pointing out how racist Israel is, I think they felt like they had to because it was just so problematic. And he was like, you know, if I didn't know, you're a smart guy. Like, if I didn't know better, I think, you know, this is the type of book you could find in an extremist backpack. I mean, that's what they said. But I think that it's true. He is a liberal hero. So for PEPs, you know, Progressive Except on Palestine, they couldn't dismiss him the way that they would maybe other people who they think of as more leftist or just people who care about Palestinians. But with the White House Correspondents' Dinner, they mentioned like Gaza in very, like in passing, but like a millisecond. But I think they spent a lot more talking about Evan. Like they named Evan, Borskovitz, who was in Russia. Like they never name any Palestinian journalists. They just mentioned that a lot of them had died and didn't say who killed them either.
And the other thing that TNC did that kind of checkmated his opponents was
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
was that he talked about the West Bank through the frame of Jim Crow and his experience in the United States, which liberals, broadly speaking, had already affirmed and accepted as gospel. And so he just took that exact thing that they had already agreed to and said, I see the same thing there. And so there was nothing they could say about it.
We're running out of time. I want to go to our colleague Hamid here, and then maybe we can wrap up. There is so much to talk about the media, but
Thank you. I don't have a question. I have a comment.
please.
Do you mind?
Yeah.
I do the same, but for the United Nations. I attend the noon briefing every day. But I want to say that it's the same. There is some powerful organization that still fear in everyone. The Secretary General himself, Guterres, on 24 of October 2023, in his speech in a ministerial meeting, he mentioned one sentence. He said, October 7 did not come in vacuum. And everything opened against him. They attacked him. They asked him to resign. They said, you don't fit. He never, ever said that sentence again. Again, on October 2nd, he issued a statement about the attack of Iran on Israel. He didn't mention Iran. Immediately, they declared him persona non grata.
Yes.
The next day, there was a meeting in the Security Council. He condemned Iran by name, explicitly. So when Israel attacked Iran, the word Israel was not mentioned. And when we ask why you mentioned Iran here, but you didn't mention Israel here, there is no answer. There is another a senior official. You don't hear from them. There is a woman called Alice Indiritu. She's in charge of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. She only wrote a report about what happened in Israel. Karim Khan, the ICC, he went and spent 3 days in Israel with the families. He went to visit this music festival. He spent 2 hours in Ramallah. And don't believe that he's trying that, don't. Another woman, Pramila Patten, she's in charge of the UN representative on sexual violence in the war zone or in the conflict areas. She wrote a report about Israel. Did you hear about anything from Audrey Azoulay? Audrey Azoulay is the UNESCO director. She's supposed to issue about this, the journalist. Did you hear from her? There is an international organization, power, whatever,
United effort, yeah. And
that is, they are observing every single person in this area. I understand if it happens here in America, yeah, they accuse you of anti-Semitism, but why those people cannot talk, cannot speak up? Why? This is my comment. Thank you.
Well, thank you. On that note, I think we just ran out of time. We could go on discussing the media for a very long time. I want to thank you all, Laila, Ryan,
Said.
Katie. It has been a real pleasure to be with you on this panel, and I hope we do it again. Thank you.
What a tough group of people. Wonderful, though, to have you all day. This brings us to the conclusion of our conference. I want to thank you and those who participated with us through various media for sticking to the time and for showing interest. I want to thank the panelists, current and previous panelists, moderators. I want to ask Muhammad, who kept things going. I again want to thank our staff, interns, and the PC committee members. We had some quality lectures and presentations today. We're going to save those on our website and make them available to people who can see them later when they have time. Please spread the word. Let's educate our fellow Americans and the rest of the world about what's happening for the sake of world peace, not just to save some lives, but for the sake of world peace. We are an NGO. We accept donations. If somebody feels generous enough to send a donation to the Jerusalem Fund. And with that, I hope that you can join us for future functions and hope to see you there. And thank you for being here.
Thank you.